Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks to the peer network for this invitation to present. I'm really happy to see a lot of people attending this talk. Yeah, despite it being the end of the school year, and there being a lot of talks going on at the moment online. So really appreciate your attendance and looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you. Right, so here we are. Can everyone hear me all right and can see the screen as well? Great. So yeah, so the title of the talk has already been announced and I've been introduced, so I'll just skip the slides. And yeah, so today I'm going to tell you about participatory action study of sexual lives of LGBTQ plus people in Bishkek that I led with, it was conducted with an LGBT organization here in Bishkek. And because it was not just a research project, it was actually an applied project to create a curriculum for queer sex education. So I'm going to also talk about what does it mean actually to teach and to learn queerly, and to present some kind of findings and conclusions from the research that we conducted. What kind of stories we were told and what do these stories mean, and what kind of futures can we build based on these stories. So that's kind of the overview of the talk. So as Helen mentioned, this is more, I guess, bringing research and education into the same story, which is kind of unusual for academia. Oftentimes research is seen as a separate activity from learning and teaching. So here all of these things were kind of combined. And it's also about politics of education, not so much about political economy, but kind of, yeah, politicizing education. So this is a quote by Galina Chirkina, who is the head of the Reproductive Health Alliance, an NGO based in Kyrgyzstan, which is kind of a child of the International Planned Parenthood network. And yeah, so in an interview to a local news outlet, she said this thing that I found very interesting. So I actually decided to include it as an epigraph to the report that I wrote after the conclusion of the study. So she says, "I'm not a feminist nor a lesbian. I simply know that control over sexuality is the true power," right? So this kind of shows to us the political significance of sex and sexuality, that despite this widely held belief that sex and sexuality is something private and personal, and something apolitical, something that is outside the realm of the political, or pre-political, it's rather pre-political, that actually a lot of social and political actors are struggling for the, for the claim to define and control sexuality. Yeah, so a lot of kind of sexuality research that has happened in Kyrgyzstan and in Central Asia is, mostly done, you know, with a focus on like, you know, population control, kind of a, you know, it's a demographics research, or it's research about behaviors, and it's like related to public health, and, you know, trying to control pandemics, epidemics, and then like spread of diseases. So there's different kind of research, but basically a lot of it focuses, of course, kind of presumes heterosexuality. So um, basically, yeah, so there's like a default understanding that, you know, all people in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan included, are presumed to be heterosexual and cisgender. And yeah, so when it comes to also sex education, it's also kind of working from those assumptions, right? So LGBT people's lives and experiences are not reflected neither in the research nor in the kind of sex education that is imagined usually. So we found that quite problematic. So I came up with the idea for this study and this project, which we called KSP, Queer Sex Просвет in Russian. So it's a queer sex ed project. In 2017, I attended a workshop in a community center of local LGBT organization called Labris, and two volunteers from IRZ, which is this Reproductive Health Alliance, who are also medical students. They volunteered to, you know, hold this workshop on basically, yeah, basic sex ed. And it really struck me observing it and participating in it, how it was based, first of all, on this kind of intention to basically kind of scare people into abstaining from sex. So, you know, horrible pictures of complications from sexually transmitted infections were shown. And yeah, so you know, it was kind of also based on this very cis heteronormative idea of what sex is. And so even though the audience was not cis hetero, right? So it was in the community center of the LGBT organization. The way the program was structured, because they were using a manual that IRZ usually uses in its work. Yeah, so it wasn't basically suitable. So the idea was then to create like a curriculum that would be based on real needs and experiences of LGBT people in Kyrgyzstan, and that would not be it would not be based on shame or fear, right? It would be yeah, a comprehensive, inclusive, feminist, you know, queer, all of these things. CREEP. So what is participatory action research? It's the kind of research, I mean, it's in the name, right? That basically involves people in the community. So it's not an outsider kind of coming to study a community, but people in the community mobilizing themselves to, you know, investigate an issue that is of significance to them, right? So usually the second part of this term action, yeah, it means it's an applied study. So they're actually seeking to take some action. And the way participatory action research works is that, you know, the members of the community are not just kind of recruited in the study to be data collectors, right? The whole process of research involves the community at different levels. People may participate in different parts of it in different capacities. But yeah, starting from like formulating research question, to, deciding on the methodology, collecting data and analyzing them, and then taking action. And what I also really like about this approach is that it presumes this kind of cycles of reflection and action, right? So basically, it's more flexible, yeah, it allows to adjust as we go along, like we reflected on something, we took action, we looked at the results of this action, then we can reflect again and adjust our further actions. So so this is what this, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the process of research, because it proceeded in several stages, from writing a grant proposal to having initial focus group discussions, recruiting co-researchers, designing the study. And yeah, so what we got was 90 in-depth biographical interviews, focus group discussions, and also then after we started actually having developing a curriculum and having classes in the community center based on our initial findings, the discussions during those lessons also then provided further material for reflection. And yeah, so but what are we dealing with basically when it comes to talking about sexuality in Kyrgyzstan? So Anara Maldosheva wrote a report back in 2012 where she kind of analyzed the local discourses on sexuality and sex education in Kyrgyzstan. So she looked at popular literature that is available like in bookshops and in the bookstalls on the streets or in just the common households in the country. She looked at reports that NGOs and international organizations produced. She looked at kind of a variety of discourses. So she basically notices this evolution of discourse on sexuality from something that is only discussed in the context of marriage as kind of the marital duty. So both partners are expected to be competent in the matter because it's part of the building a harmonious marriage. So this existed in the early 90s. And that then there was a transition under the influence of global discourses that were brought in through international organizations, NGOs, mass media, etc., that viewed sexual activity as a risky behavior, right? So, so there's discourse of safe sex, or containing, birth rates and things like that. Containing epidemics. So she identifies several forms of discourses on sexuality. So there's medicalized. So these are now in the parentheses, I have titles of the books or reports that she analyzes. So the medicalized discourse, demographic, psychological, the way development agencies talk about sexuality and sex, and moralizing, right? And of course, all of these exist at the same time. Oftentimes they intermixed. But once again, she finds it often quite problematic, also from the perspective of gender equality, the kind of messages that these texts and discourses convey. So we also find that, yeah, like this situation that existed was problematic. So we set out to, yeah, so we set out to do something that would satisfy us. So these and other illustrations in this presentation are illustrations to the book that doesn't exist yet, but that will be produced at some point, inshallah, based on this research. So it would be like a manual. And yeah, so Deniz Nazarova created these. Deniz Nazar created this especially for the project. So this kind of is a map of sexuality, where you have non-binary lake and you know, basically various configurations of sexuality. They're not just about the gender of attraction, but about a variety of other things that constitute human sexuality. Yeah, so what does it mean then, like when we wanted to create this queer sex education? We had to kind of deconstruct, yeah, a lot of ideas about, because people usually assume that, you know, sex education is easy. You just, you know, teach people how to use contraception, you know, yeah, that's about it. But the way we approached it is basically, you know, again, like we wanted to move away from this medicalized and normative way of talking about sex and sexuality, and we wanted to basically politicize these things, and to since I'm a social scientist, you know, I approach these things as a social scientist. Yeah, so, but what is the state of sex education in Kyrgyzstan to begin with? So Kyrgyz law on the reproductive rights of citizens of Kyrgyzstan guarantees sexual education for all school children. So it's not included as like a separate subject, but it's included, it's supposed to be taught during so-called классные часы. So it's basically like extracurricular meetings that teachers have. So each class has their классный руководитель. So it's like an assigned teacher who is responsible for welfare of the class. And they hold these informal or quite formalized meetings, but outside of class hours, where they're supposed to discuss, you know, various things like, you know, issues of drug addiction, or, you know, yeah, all sorts of things. Yeah, sex education is supposed to be part of that kind of extracurricular education in schools. So, you know, 6 to 9 hours per school year, I guess, are dedicated to this. This is on paper, right? Like what exists, what's supposed to be happening. But our research and other studies show that oftentimes teachers are not empowered to do that, or, you know, students actually, students are not knowledgeable and empowered as a result of whatever activity is happening. Also, then there is a backlash, right? So we observe in 2010s this conservative turn and backlash against this very limited sex education that is offered by schools and NGOs. So there's a whole story about a textbook on safe living, which had a chapter on sex and sexuality. The authors were basically taken to court over it, and even though they won in court 3 times, the Ministry of Education still pulled out the books from the curriculum. Then there were these brochures that were published by ARZ, the Reproductive Health Alliance, that were basically answering questions, real questions from teenagers, right? And again, like there was a whole controversy and scandals and, you know, basically persecution of this NGO because of those brochures. And then even the discussion of the draft bill of the law that was eventually adopted on the reproductive health, the discussion in the parliament looked almost comical because how embarrassed, you know, it's mostly male MPs were by, you know, even the mentioning of the word sex, you know, and the authors of the draft bill talked about reproductive and sexual rights and reproductive and sexual health and education and all of those. And the MPs basically insisted that you know, the word sex and sexual and its derivatives should be just, you know, erased from the text because, you know, there's no need for that word because, you know, reproductive already covers that in their eyes, yeah. And one of the main points of controversy in that discussion was also this provision for, you know, compulsory sex education in schools. And yeah, like there were other points in the bill that the MPs saw as kind of advancing gay rights or, you know, like pushing the gay agenda. So we can see that, yeah, like it's in this period also that a draft bill copying the Russian homophobic gay propaganda law was, you know, introduced to Kyrgyz parliament. So yeah, like all of these developments are happening. So yeah, so like there's a debate of even having the very basics, like cis heteronormative sex education, let alone, you know, like of course, any discussion of, you know, non-heterosexual or yeah, non-cisgender existence. So what would a queer sex education look like? We asked ourselves, what is queer about queer sex education and how do we queer sex education? So this is an illustration, another or one of the illustrations. There is basically a hierarchy of relationships and identities. It's based on Gail Rubin's famous essay, Thinking Sex, where she talks about this like charmed circle where basically the society creates this hierarchy of, you know, what is considered appropriate, blessed, you know, good, yeah, healthy sexuality, as opposed to, you know, all the things that are opposite of that. And yeah, so we can see that there's yeah, anyways, I'll just move on. So Kevin Komashiro, in his book about queer teaching, queer education, identifies 4 types of, you know, like possible definitions of what queer education might look like, right? So first it's education about the other, right? So it's a curriculum that includes information about LGBTQ plus people and other oppressed groups. Then there's education for the other, right? So it's a special curriculum for LGBTQ people aimed at education and empowerment of the communities. Thirdly, there's education that is critical of privileging and otherness, right? So, and finally, education that changes students and society. So it's this kind of like, radical teaching, which basically has its purpose the transformation of society, right? And this is very close to what Paulo Freire wrote about, right? So education is seen as a liberatory practice. And yeah, in our project, we basically kind of adhere to these last three understandings, yeah? So it was specifically by LGBT people, for LGBT people, for specific needs, but also, trying to do that other work. And at the same time, though, our philosophy was that, this education, any educational curricula that centers the experiences and needs of the most marginalized people, it's actually better for everybody, right? So in my blurb for this talk, I wrote a quote from Paulo Freire, in which he says it's actually the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well, right? So nobody's going to come and liberate you. You have to do this work for yourself. It's this, process of education should be about reclaiming one's humanity. But because the oppressors, in doing the oppression, also lose their humanity, it's a kind of like a gift, yeah? And maybe not intentional, but it's the gift of the oppressed to the oppressors, yeah? That in liberating themselves, they kind of liberate everybody. So after, reading a lot of literature and reflection and discussion, these are the principles for queer sex education that we kind of distilled. Of course, there may be other things to add, and it's not an exhaustive list, but basically you should start by researching the main challenges and difficulties that people in the community face. Based on the research findings, identify the generative themes and concepts around which to organize the educational process. So for us, in the focus group discussions and in interviews, we identified such generative themes and concepts. So our lessons were structured around those concepts. So first of all, we talked about bodies and embodiment and, sexual anatomy. We talked about pleasure and orgasm. We talked about sexual communication, how to talk about sex, and consent. We talked about ideas of family, yeah, what does it mean for queer people, and reproductive rights and justice, so these are just some examples, yeah, of how we organized the lesson around these themes. And then every lesson I would start from actually giving a small report, basically, from the interview data. So I would basically start by pulling slides up with quotes from the interviews where people talk about these things, yeah, in their lives, right? Like what is sex for them? How do they find partners? How do they discuss things with their partners? Or like, yeah, whatever. You basically start from the things that people already know. People can relate to what other people in the community said, reflect on their own experiences, and then we would proceed to more theoretical knowledge. There would always be space for collective discussion. So, the lessons would be also, they would involve some kind of exercises, kind of lively activities, that that would spark further discussion and reflection. It's not strictly a lecture, but more, I guess, resembles more a training format that, NGOs practice. Finally, the aim of this, because it happens outside of formal education, right? So it's not in school or university. There's not going to be an exam, right? There's not going to be a grade given for this, and people come entirely voluntarily, right, to these classes on weekends. People, they were really well attended classes. So it was a really great teaching experience for me, because I got to teach in a very unalienated way, right? So I had a very engaged audience who were there because they were curious. The purpose of this kind of education then is to create this kind of critical consciousness that Paulo Freire talks about, and ultimately, to affect some kind of social change. So I think these kind of lessons would benefit basically anybody, right? So even though they were created specifically for this audience, I think they're quite actually universal in their significance. So here are some nice illustrations again from Deniz Nazar. So this is when we talked about like reproduction. So these are, trans men and a trans woman, and, reproductive possibilities that their bodies hold. When we talked to our interlocutors, they basically they told their life stories, right? So it was the format of the interview was a biographical, in-depth interview. So it presupposes like a free self-narrative, right? So we had like an interview guide, but basically the people we talked to could just tell us about their lives. So we used kind of a narrative approach, so that's a discourse analytical approach, and we looked at kind of the sexual scenarios and sexual stories that our respondents told us. So this idea of sexual stories comes from work of Ken Plummer, a sociologist of sexuality, who said this: we have become the sexual storytelling society. Until very recently, almost all of these stories have been taken as signs of truth. They have been presumed to tell us something about our essential sexual nature. So this kind of rhymes quite well with the whole thesis in the first volume of History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault. Yeah, so Foucault basically makes the same argument. He says that, so he argues against what he calls the repressive hypothesis. He says that actually the modern Western society has seen this proliferation of discourses about sex and sexuality rather than suppression of the discourses. It's just that, it's a certain, they encourage certain ways of talking and thinking about these matters, and they produced certain types of subjectivity, right? So they created these new subject positions, new identities, new ways of being a person in the modern world. So today it's kind of a common sense for us to think that our sexuality kind of reveals a core truth, a core, like it represents a core identity. The other concept that we used in our analysis is this idea of sexual scenarios that was introduced by, again, sociologists Simon and Gagnon, who basically argue that sexuality is basically very much connected to, society, culture, politics, that we learn to feel, that we, what appears to us as instinct and biology is in fact learned behavior. And so a lot of kind of especially gendered sexual scenarios are very much ingrained in our collective psyche. So we absorb them through culture, but then we kind of internalize them on the intrapsychic level and enact these ideas and beliefs in our interpersonal relationships. Our respondents basically told us three kinds of sexual stories. The first kind is a story of sexual awakening, or gender self-awareness for trans and non-binary people. The second type is coming out stories, and finally stories of trauma and survival of the trauma. So in a kind of social constructivist view of storytelling of these kind of biographical narratives, they are seen as kind of part of doing identity work. So, it's an ongoing project of creating our own subjectivities through telling stories about ourselves. So biographical narrative is kind of essentially what is happening here. So these kind of gendered sexual scenarios and stories were used by our respondents to build this self-narrative as a queer person, or to build their identity around their gender and sexuality. These are stories that we also observe, all over the world. So these stories are not told in a vacuum, right? So they're always very personal, but they're also very kind of grounded in the social and political context that people operate in. So people are aware of the discourses that already exist. And so they tell their stories accordingly, right? Because they anticipate or they observe the reaction of the audiences. They kind of adjust their narratives accordingly. So what we found is that these dominant discourses coexist with kind of alternative or counter narratives within the same story oftentimes, or these normative scenarios and storytelling patterns are used to kind of retrospectively help do this identity work. So for instance, this gendered sexual scenario of what constitutes a sexual act in the heterosexual relationship, like a penetrative sex, which is supposed to result in vaginal orgasm, right? So this idea of vaginal orgasm, and one of our respondents, she used that to kind of explain how she realized that she was a lesbian, because she was married and she never had that kind of so this idea of vaginal orgasm was popularized by Sigmund Freud, who basically kind of demonized clitoral orgasm, right? He said it's immature, it's like illegitimate. So she was, when she was married and she was having sex with her husband, she couldn't orgasm that way. So she concluded that she's frigid, in her own words. But then when she was with her current partner, she could actually experience that kind of orgasm. So she figured that means that, I'm really lesbian. And similarly, like, a trans woman uses this normative discourse and of virginity, again, to kind of construct her, to do this identity work and kind of affirm her femininity through these like normative expectations of virginity and things like that. So there are many examples, and maybe you can ask me in the Q&A part of the talk, and I'm happy to provide them. So the trauma stories were marked also by ambiguity and uncertainty oftentimes, and some kind of like minimization of violence that was done to our respondents, and oftentimes they would blame themselves. So again, like this is happening in the context of what is called rape culture, the culture of blaming the victim. And so the people who are telling these stories are very aware that this is going to happen when they tell their stories. So it's very important for them to simultaneously tell the story in a way that shows that they were not in the control of the situation, but also kind of maintaining their subjectivity and agency. So so the narrators of these stories, they know about the dominant discourses of blaming the victim. And so, yeah, they construct their stories in this way. So there's all these stories, they often, as I mentioned, they contain both the dominant narrative, but also the alternative narrative and counter narrative. And so when we do this kind of research, we should, especially if it's an activist research, right? We should kind of do this work of double listening for these kind of discourses of resistance. And yeah, so that we don't just retell the stories and re-traumatize people and just kind of put experiences in the realm of personal responsibility and experiences. So it's really important to politicize these experiences and to place them in the realm of the social and kind of structural issues. So we kind of tried to do that with my colleagues. So this book that was mentioned in the beginning was co-authored with Georgi Mamedov and Nina Bagdasarova, who is another colleague of ours in psychology department at the UCA. Yeah, so in this book, we kind of tried to do that. We basically tried to shift the focus from, like basically we don't just want to put the responsibility for the kind of distress that people are feeling, the kind of unhappiness they're experiencing. We don't want to put this responsibility on the individuals that are feeling those feelings. We want to kind of show how these feelings are based in social realities and political decisions. And we take, again, in this book, a kind of approach that if Kosovsky-Sedgwick calls the universalizing view of gender and sexuality. So basically, it's a book again specifically for LGBT people, but we said not only, yeah, like so anybody can actually benefit from it, and can actually learn some things. So these counter narratives and counter hegemonic practices already exist in queer communities. So this idea, for instance, of chosen family, or this community that in the post-Soviet space is called Tema. Yeah, so it's a community of solidarity among queer people. Or for instance, there's different ways of like connecting to people and building solidarity and showing care and support. That's, I think, where I'm going to stop. I don't know if I went over time. I apologize if I did. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mohira. A very interesting topic, which we don't hear a lot about when we deal with Central Asia. So I think it's very necessary work.